Has martyrdom ever been important in Shinto history?
Shinto tradition reveres many religious heroes who died defending their emperor and homeland. They are martyrs in the broadest sense of the term. They died not for a religious creed narrowly defined, but out of allegiance to the larger complex of beliefs that has been integral to Japanese history and culture. People like the cultural icon Sugawara Michizane, who is said to have perished as a result of his convictions, take their place alongside the royal heroes, the princes who died in defense of the imperial house. Shrines designated as nation-protecting shrines are dedicated to the memory of war dead. They enshrine as kami the souls of all who gave their lives out of conviction. Yasukuni Jinja in Tokyo is a fine example of such a martyr memorial.
Have Buddhists traditionally sent out missionaries to convert others?
Buddhism's vigorous missionary heritage is traditionally traced to Kings Ashoka. 270 to 230 BCE, and Kanishka, r. c. 120 to 160 CE. The first is said to have converted to Buddhism after repenting of his bloody conquests. Ashoka declared the Buddha's teaching the official creed of the realm. Tradition credits Kanishka with supplying a major impetus to Buddhism's spread into Central and Eastern Asia. Monks, and, to a lesser extent, nuns, have historically been the most important and effective missionaries. Wherever they traveled, they carried sacred texts and art as their prime teaching tools. Buddhist missionary work continues in the form of various contemporary adaptations of traditional methods of evangelization. They call their missionary workers Dhammaduttas, those who spread the Dharma. Convinced of the universal relevance of the teaching. In much of Theravada Southeast Asia, missionaries continue to bring the message of Buddhism to rural areas. In Thailand, for example, teams of 5 travel about from March to June. Then return to monasteries for the rainy season retreat. They begin by setting up a monastery and training young boys in the temple compound. Eventually they start to visit homes and ask about people's general well-being. The next step is to start elementary schools and encourage youngsters to enter the monastic life. Reducing crime and maintaining order according to the Buddha believed that there is a direct correlation between crime and poverty. Because crime and immorality lead to poverty, it would be useless to suppress crime through punishment. The Buddha preached that if society were to improve the economic conditions of the poor, then crime would cease. Order could be maintained through mutual love, affection, and respect between citizens. The Buddha not only preached these utopian ideals but also experimented with them. For example, governing the society of Buddhist monks and nuns is a strict code of vows enforcing the Buddha's vision. Every gift received is to be collectively held in the name of the group, not the individual.
Have relics been important in the Shinto tradition?
Sacred objects play a very important role in Shinto ritual. Every shrine houses some small token of the deity who graciously calls this humble place home for the benefit of worshippers who come to pay their respects. These objects, called Goshintai or revered kami body, are said to include such unremarkable items as a mirror, sword, comb, ball of iron, paintings, pebbles, or pieces of carefully cut paper. Worshippers generally do not get even a passing glimpse of the objects, for they remain always behind the innermost shrine's closed doors. People visit a shrine not so much because the sacred objects are there, as because the presence of the kami makes the place holy. When Christians or Buddhists, for example, make pilgrimage to a special church or stupa, they frequently do so because certain objects associated with a particular sacred person are enshrined there. They may not believe that the objects themselves contain miraculous powers, but it is the presence of the objects that makes the place worth visiting. Shinto's sacred objects play a very different role. Many worshippers may not even be aware of exactly what items a given shrine holds. In other words, the symbols of the kami are of secondary importance from the perspective of Shinto worshippers.
Do deists pray in any particular language?
Since Daoism originated in China, one would naturally expect that most practitioners of the tradition pray in Chinese. That is so not because of any essential identification of Chinese as a sacred language or liturgical tongue as such. Use of the vernacular has been the general practice in Daoism. And until recently it happens that most practitioners have been Chinese speakers. So as small pockets of Daoist practice have arisen here and there outside China, especially in recent times, practitioners have used their native tongues in ritual.
What sort of symbolism is important in Hindu religious sculpture and painting?
Images of the deities convey their distinctive meanings through a combination of iconographic clues or themes. Here are some of the most important categories or types of imagery. Unusual physical features naturally strike the viewer immediately. They may include non-human appendages, multiple arms, or faces, and stylized or highly exaggerated male or female characteristics. Features like these function as reminders of the otherness and mystery of the deity. Smaller distinctive bodily marks, the diamond on Vishnu's chest, along with items of clothing or ornament, are part of the standard repertoire. Posture and gesture are very important. Some deities are shown in a rigidly upright posture. but many popular images adopt the triple bend or S-curve posture that suggests warmth, attractiveness, and accessibility. Artists can choose from a wide range of hand gestures, but certain specific gestures are by convention associated with certain deities. They can communicate anything from reassurance to the wrath that awaits evildoers. The same is true of the various implements or devices symbolic of each deity's special prerogatives. Weapons and musical instruments are the most common items of this type. Weapons remind devotees of the deity's protective power. Musical instruments, of the divine power of enchantment. Deities often appear with their consorts, or female counterparts, Shiva with Parvati, Vishnu with Lakshmi, Krishna with Radha, Rama with Sita, and with their offspring, Shiva's Ganesha and Skanda. Or special assistants, Rama with Hanuman, and any number of deities with guardian figures. Finally, each of the major deities has his or her vehicle or mode of conveyance. Vishnu's eagle Garuda, for example, and these often appear in images.
What should I expect to see upon entering a synagogue?
Synagogues of the various different Jewish communities use their interior spaces in different ways. But the one thing you will invariably see is the ark. Almost as soon as you enter, your eye will be drawn to the back wall. There, a pair of small doors, or perhaps a beautifully embroidered or brocade cloth, mark the place in which the Torah scrolls are kept. This is the post-temple version of the Ark of the Covenant. Should you visit during worship ceremonies, you will also see the Torah scroll itself. Often cloaked in a beautiful cloth, sometimes tooled silver. Some Torah scrolls are topped with a crown, keter, as a reminder of the kingly, royal status of the divine source. Inside the cloth a binder, mappa, might further protect the scrolls from damage. Many Ashkenazic synagogues in Central and Eastern Europe also adorn the scroll with a Torah shield, TAS. Wealthier synagogues often possess many sets of Torah scrolls, used in rotation for different occasions. In order to keep track of the point in the text at which a given scroll was open, the elaborately tooled silver Torah shield might have interchangeable plates with the word Sabbath or the name of a particular holy day. Many synagogues will have a bimah, high place, also called al-mimar, a platform on which there is a desk to hold the Torah scrolls for reading. Traditional communities place the bimah, which symbolically replaces the temple altar, in the center of the space facing the ark. Reform synagogues move it nearer the ark, elevated on a stage and facing the congregation. A sanctuary lamp is also symbolic of the sacred presence and is usually located near the ark. One feature that often distinguishes Orthodox synagogues is the provision of separate sections for men and women, with men typically in front and women behind or to the side, either on the main floor or in a gallery above. Like many contemporary mosques, Some synagogues separate genders with a partition running front to back down the center of the main floor.
How did so many different Christian churches come into being?
Three major points of division mark the history of Christianity. And nearly all of the tradition's diverse branches derive from those critical events. Intense controversy over the theological identity of Jesus culminated in the Council of Chalcedon. In present-day Turkey, in 451, decrees of the council taught definitively that Jesus was one person possessing both human and divine natures. In so doing, Chalcedon ruled against both the Nestorian heresy and the various monophysite Christians. The former taught that Jesus was two distinct persons in one. Modern-day Nestorians call themselves Assyrian Christians. According to the latter, Christ was not human at all. Today the many originally monophysite churches include Coptic and Abyssinian groups in Egypt and Ethiopia, Syrian Jacobites, and the Armenian Orthodox Church. Even though the majority of these groups eventually came to accept Chalcedon's formulation, the initial effect of the council was to separate what have come to be the indigenous Middle Eastern churches from the rest of Mediterranean Christendom. A second point of division came officially in 1054, the culmination of centuries of disagreement, both theological and political, between the Rome-based Western Church and the Constantinople-based Eastern Church. Pope Leo IX, 1049-54, sent emissaries to excommunicate the Eastern Patriarch on the basis of his refusal to accept changes in the language of the Nicene Creed. Finally, the largest of all the divisions was set in motion by several 14th-15th century Christian reformers, including John Wycliffe, c. 1329-84, and John Huss, c. 1369-1415. And culminating in the work of Martin Luther, 1483-1546, John Calvin, 1509-1564, and Henry VIII, 1491-1547, of England.
How did the Vedic scriptures describe the ultimate spiritual powers?
Vedic cosmology divided the universe into three regions: sky, lower atmosphere, and earth. 11 of the 33 chief deities held sway over each of the cosmic realms. A deity much like the Greek Zeus ruled the sky, but he was not the head of a divine if often unruly family as Zeus was. Members of the Vedic pantheon seem to have risen to prominence at different times, as reflected by the numbers of hymns devoted to several individual gods. An atmospheric wind deity called Vayu and the celestial Surya, the sun, played important but still not central roles. The celestial Varuna had once headed the pantheon and oversaw cosmic order. His main competition was the atmospheric Indra, lord of inclement weather. At some point Indra eclipsed Varuna. perhaps because Indra represented a more fearsome power and imminent danger. Only the terrestrial Agni, god of fire and thus essential to Vedic sacrifice, merited more hymns than Indra. But before long even Indra bowed to two upcoming powers, the celestial Vishnu, all-pervading, and the atmospheric Rudra, the howler. Rudra eventually came to be associated with the formidable Shiva. Together, Vishnu and Shiva symbolized the global forces of sustenance and dissolution powers that most engaged the Hindu religious imagination.
Have dreams and visions or other spirit manifestations been important in Shinto tradition?
Shinto legends are full of famous figures who have enjoyed or barely survived encounters with the spirit world. Many religiously prominent individuals have claimed to receive divine visitations and privileged communications in dreams. Various spirits, even evil ones, Goryo, are capable of making their presence known for the purpose of delivering a message. These spirits, also called living human kami, arahitogame, can return in their human form to make things both positive and negative happen in the land of the living. Certain famous people, like Prince Shotoku Taishi, 574 to 622, and poet calligrapher Sugawara Michizane, 845 to 903, to whom over 10,000 shrines are dedicated, who died untimely or violent deaths later became kami, but could also exert unhappy influence if not dealt with properly. This is a striking amalgam of positive and negative powers in one spirit. Such a spirit can manifest itself in frightening apparitions as well as in blessings.
How many different kinds of religious calendars are there?
All calendars naturally have intimate connections to some sort of astronomical calculation, but there are various ways of determining the particulars. There are solar and lunar calendars, seasonal and non-seasonal. Seasonal calendars are generally solar. Major annual observances reflect regional agricultural cycles. Some festivities are associated with planting, others with harvest. Still others with the fallow season of winter. Such calendars often place special emphasis on the winter and summer solstices, respectively the shortest and longest days of the year, and on the vernal and autumnal equinoxes. The days in spring and fall when daylight and nighttime hours are equal. Lunar calendars can be either seasonal or non-seasonal, depending on whether and how the system inserts days or months to compensate for the fact that the lunar year rotates backwards against the solar. Each lunar year begins approximately 11 days earlier each solar year. If the first day of a lunar calendar corresponds with the first day of this year's solar calendar, then the next year the lunar calendar will begin on the equivalent of December 20th or 21. A lunar calendar that inserts an extra month every few solar years can both maintain its observance of the shorter lunar months and keep each festivity connected to the appropriate part of the agricultural cycle. Non-seasonal calendars, generally lunar, do not compensate for the discrepancy between the religious year and the agricultural seasons. As a result, major annual observances coincide with the solar calendar in cycles of approximately 33 years.
How does Christian tradition interpret history? What is millennialism?
Christian tradition, like the Jewish and Islamic traditions, views history generally as a linear process with a beginning, middle, and end. Christian and Islamic views are different from the Jewish in that both later traditions regard the ages of their central figures, Jesus and Muhammad, as the high points of history. Christians believe Jesus the Christ entered the world at the fullness of time, establishing a new dispensation and initiating a sense of expectation of the eventual end of time. All that went before Jesus pointed to him, and all that will happen since his life on earth moves inexorably toward a final resolution over which Jesus Christ will preside. Christian expectation of the end times is an ancient theme with roots in Jewish tradition and in the New Testament. Just as the identification of Jesus as the Christ fulfilled the hopes of some Jews for a Messiah, Jesus' own preaching seems to have fueled further anticipation of history's grand finale. Many early Christians apparently thought the end was imminent. For we find important writers backtracking and suggesting that no one can know when the day of the Lord will come. E.g. I Thessalonians 5:1-11. Eventually the idea emerged that Jesus would come again after a millennium, 1,000 years, and rule for another 1,000 before bringing time to an end.
What did the Jewish state declared on May 14, 1948?
In the 1930s, the world's Jews could see that the survival of European Jews depended on mass immigration to Palestine and to friendly states. This humanitarian imperative, however, was rejected by Britain and by those countries, like the United States, where Jews might conceivably have found a home. Faced with Hitler's hatred on the one hand, and world indifference on the other, the world's Jews realized the absolute need for a Jewish homeland, a sovereign state where Judaism was not only a religion, but a nationality. With the proclamation of an independent Jewish state on May 14, 1948, for the first time since the destruction of the Temple and the dispersion of the Jews, Jewishness became a national as well as a religious identity. By the law of return, every Jew had a right to Israeli citizenship. Thus the State of Israel had become a solution to the problem of the Jews, whose history since the dispersion had been one of trauma and tragedy. In medieval England the Jews had been expelled, in 15th century Spain they had endured the same fate. In most cases, Jews could not achieve political equality in the lands where they settled. And they lacked a land they could call their own and to which they could return. The proclamation of an independent Israel was the signal for a combined attack by the Arab states. After initial setbacks and mixed success, the Israelis were able to create a national army and to arm it, to an extent, with modern weapons. As a result of these efforts, the tide of battle gradually turned, and, by the end of 1948, Israeli forces led a campaign through southern Palestine and even into Egypt itself. In a later thrust, an Israeli column drove down to the Red Sea, securing the port of Eilat. During one of several ceasefires, Count Folke Bernadotte af Wisborg, the United Nations mediator, was assassinated by Zionist terrorists. Finally, by July 1949, armistice agreements were signed with the Arab states.
What is the imperial oath in Japan?
The following oath is taken from the 1889 Constitution of the Empire of Japan. It was spoken by the Emperor in the sanctuary of the Imperial Palace. We, the successor to the prosperous throne of our predecessors, do humbly and solemnly swear to the imperial founder of our house, and to our other imperial ancestors that, in pursuance of a great policy coextensive with the heavens and with the earth, we shall maintain and secure from decline the ancient form of government. In consideration of the progressive tendency of the course of human affairs and in parallel with the advance of civilization, we deem it expedient, in order to give clearness and distinctness to the instructions bequeathed by the imperial founder of our house and by our other imperial ancestors, to establish fundamental laws formulated into express provisions of law, so that, on the one hand, our imperial posterity may possess an express guide for the course they are to follow, and that, on the other, our subjects shall thereby be enabled to enjoy a wider range of action in giving us their support, and that the observance of our laws shall continue to the remotest ages of time. We will thereby give greater firmness to the stability of our country, and promote the welfare of all the people within the boundaries of our dominions. And we now establish the imperial house law and the constitution. These laws come to only an exposition of grand precepts for the conduct of the government, bequeathed by the imperial founder of our house and by our other imperial ancestors, that we have been so fortunate in our reign, in keeping with the tendency of the times, as to accomplish this work. We owe to the glorious spirits of the imperial founder of our house and of our other imperial ancestors. We now reverently make our prayer to them and to our illustrious father, and implore the help of their sacred spirits, and make to them solemn oath never at this time nor in the future to fail to be an example to our subjects in the observance of the laws hereby established. May the heavenly spirits witness this our solemn oath.
Who are the Fathers of the Church and why are they important?
Some of Christianity's most important religious and theological literature dates from the 4th to the 8th centuries CE. During the patristic age, or late antiquity, dozens of influential authors from North Africa, through the central Middle East and Anatolia, now called Turkey, to Rome and westward even to Spain, wrote major works in Latin, Greek, and Syriac. Patristic literature includes virtually every type, from extensive biblical commentaries to sermons to theological treatises. Among the most important Latin fathers are Augustine, 354 to 430, Bishop of Hippo in North Africa and author of the monumental City of God and one of the best-known spiritual autobiographies, The Confessions. Tradition credits Augustine with a monastic rule that has influenced religious orders such as the Dominicans and Servites, as well as Ursuline and Visitation nuns. Major Greek fathers include the three Cappadocians, so called because they lived and worked in the province of Cappadocia in Asia Minor, now in east-central Turkey. More famous were Basil, c. 330 to 379, and his brother Gregory of Nyssa, c. 330 to 395. Gregory of Nazianzus, 329 to 389, like the other Gregory, was an outspoken bishop much involved in the theological controversies of the day. All three made critical contributions to the clarification of Christian doctrines about Christ and the Trinity. Less famous but very important in the early Christian history in the Eastern Mediterranean are the Syriac Fathers. They wrote in a Semitic language related to the Aramaic commonly spoken in the time of Jesus. Ephraim of Syria, 306 to 373, authored dozens of works, almost all in verse and including many hymns that are still sung in worship rituals.
How does the Buddhist tradition describe existence in general?
Buddhist teaching focuses on three fundamental qualities of all things. Two are fairly obvious to anyone who cares to look, and are at the heart of the experience of enlightenment. The first is hardship or suffering, the second impermanence. Nobody is immune to sadness and disappointment. No one has a lock on success and genuine contentment. And everything comes to an end. Everything. The third quality is far from obvious even to the most careful observer. But an awareness of it does follow from the realities of suffering and impermanence. That is the notion that there is no permanent, indestructible core or soul at the center of any being. Hindu tradition taught Siddhartha Gautama that at the center of each individual being was a self or Atman that survived physical death to be reincarnated in another life. assuming the person died still enslaved by the effects of self-centered choices. The Buddha's reinterpretation of Hindu tradition on this point was so radical that it cuts right to the psychological bone.
Is there a central teaching authority for Muslims?
No single individual or institution has universal authority over the global Islamic community. For Sunni Muslims, the nearest approximation to centralized teaching authorities are religiously affiliated. Educational institutions in Egypt and Saudi Arabia, venerable and influential for very different reasons. Cairo's Al-Azhar, founded in 972 by the Ismaili, Sevener Shiite, Fatimid dynasty, has worn the mantle of religious prestige and authoritative conservatism since it was converted by Saladin and his dynasty. After 1171, for the task of defending the cause of Sunni Islam. In Saudi Arabia, educational institutions of Mecca and Medina have come to share in Al-Azhar's prestige in modern times. Young men seeking careers in religious studies come from all over the world, looking forward to returning home with credentials from these institutions. Nowadays, a senior jurist somewhere might on very rare occasions issue a legal advisory fatwa, claiming universal force, so that every Muslim ought to abide by it. The Ayatollah Khomeini, for example, delivered an order that Salman Rushdie was liable to the death penalty for blasphemy. And Osama bin Laden has called for a jihad against the United States. But rare claims of that sort do not have the binding authority of a centralized institution like the papacy. In various parts of the world, religious scholars join together for consultative purposes. In the United States, for example, a council of imams holds regular gatherings to discuss practical and pastoral problems that arise in local communities. Elsewhere, muftis in a given region sometimes submit their decisions to the further judgment of a grand mufti, who exercises special jurisdiction in religious matters.
What was the religion in ancient Egypt?
Religion was the very core of ancient Egyptian culture, 3500 BCE 950 BCE. It permeated every aspect of life, including art, medicine, and science. Egyptians believed that the gods had created Egypt as an oasis of order and inherent good amidst the forces of chaos that constantly threatened to overwhelm them. Justice, morality, and beauty called Ma'at by the Egyptians consisted of behavior in accordance with that tradition. The Egyptian religion featured many deities, some strange but with human features, others clearly non-human, but all responsible for every aspect of life, from birth to death. The king of the gods was Amon-Re, followed by Aten, the disk that symbolized the sun god. Osiris, the god of both the Nile and the realm of the dead, and Isis, the moon goddess, wife of Osiris, Mother of the universe, and Queen of the world. Each god was associated with a particular sacred animal: cat, bull, crocodile, or scarab, beetle, and huge temples were dedicated to their worship. In these temples, which were run by priests, the gods and goddesses made contact with humans through cult statues. Ordinary people prayed at the temple gates and were not normally allowed inside. Though they were offered a peek at the Egyptian gods during great processions.
Are there deist hierarchical structures?
Since there are many different sects and schools, there are no official and universally acknowledged hierarchical structures that unite all deists. But there are de facto hierarchies, both religious, within individual deist organizations, and social, based on a broader kind of class consciousness. For example, in the Celestial Masters School, the living Heavenly Master functions as a sort of archbishop, overseeing the running of the school's temples in the region. Within the administration of the school, ranks are named after those of the imperial bureaucracy, such as libationer, recorder, and director of ceremonies. The Celestial Masters School has retained much of its ancient hierarchical structure today. In addition, each of the various monastic orders is internally structured according to authority and leadership roles, with the equivalent of an abbot at the head. Hierarchical structures have also been very much a part of the several short-lived attempts to create theocratic states, but their claims to authority were naturally limited. Within their everyday lives, most deists would likely be aware only of the functional hierarchy inherent in the more elaborate ritual celebrations. There, a high priest presides, while subordinate priests perform much of the ceremonial action and musical accompaniment. Other non-ordained assistants busy themselves with the overall mechanics of the ritual, keeping the action moving by making sure necessary supplies are plentiful and other practical matters are in order.
Who are the Samaritans?
After the northern kingdom's capital, Samaria, was overrun by the Assyrians in 721 BCE. Many of the leading and best educated Jewish citizens were deported. The invaders imported significant numbers of colonists who gradually infiltrated the people of Israel. They came to trace their ancestry to the tribes of Manasseh and Ephraim, thus identifying themselves as Jewish at least genealogically, and intermarried with Jews. The Samaritans established their own temple on Mt. Gerizim. As a result of a falling out with Nehemiah in the 5th century, the Samaritans split off from Judaism, more or less definitively, and came to think of themselves as a separate people. Now very few in numbers, the Samaritans still have their own version of the Torah and distinctive codes of religious law. At Passover they still sacrifice a lamb on Mt. Gerizim. Only a small community of Samaritans, well under 1,000, survive. Plagued by health problems as a result of inbreeding. Most Samaritans live around the city of Nablus in the West Bank.
How and where do members of local Hindu communities come together?
Local and regional temples are the major gathering places. Hindus use religiously and socially and support financially. Individual temples in India are generally dedicated predominantly to a particular deity. Most center around some aspect or manifestation of Shiva or Vishnu, or one of their major female consorts or counterparts. A temple will typically also have subordinate shrines dedicated to other names and forms of the central deity. Some smaller local temples may also belong exclusively to sex-worshipping deities largely unknown outside the area. Most temples draw sectarian client. In many regions outside India, however, greater diversity in the makeup of local communities often requires greater flexibility in the religious orientation of temples. For example, Indian immigrants around American cities such as Pittsburgh and St. Louis come from various places in India and represent a variety of sectarian backgrounds. As a result, the temples that serve the regions are sensitive to a wider spectrum of devotional needs than might be the case at a local temple in an area where Hindus are in the majority and where one sect predominates. Large temples in both Pittsburgh and St. Louis have been funded by Indian populations largely of immigrants from South India. Both temples are therefore dedicated to a popular South Indian manifestation of Vishnu called Sri Venkateshvara, Lord of the Sin-Forgiving Hill. But in order to serve the diverse local population, both temples include prominent devotional symbolism familiar both to Shaivites and to Vaishnavites.
Are there cyclical Shinto observances, such as feasts that happen regularly but not annually?
Some gatherings still take place on set days in certain odd-numbered months, but not monthly. For example, a practice called waiting for the sun, Himachi, finds people gathered private residences on the 15th day of the 1st, 5th, and 9th lunar months to keep vigil until dawn. A Shinto priest is often among the celebrants during the same months, but on the odd-numbered nights of the third week. People come together in groups awaiting the moon, Tsukamaki. September's full moon is especially beautiful, for it falls in the 9th month and is known as the harvest moon. Participants celebrate the lunar beauty with special songs and food. These gatherings occur only in homes. Some people still make special arrangements to observe their unlucky year age. 42 for men and 33 for women with rites at a shrine to ward off misfortune. They may take precautions by means of extra rituals of purification on that day. Some regard certain days each month as fortuitous connection days because they associate them with particular kami, and such days often occasion shrine visitation.
When and where did Judaism begin? Was it founded by an individual person?
Jewish tradition traces its beginnings back nearly 4,000 years. Abraham is the key figure here. Not as a founder but as the first Hebrew to receive a revelation from God. Genesis 11-25 contain the bulk of our scriptural information about Abraham. According to tradition, God told Abraham to leave his homeland in Mesopotamia, present-day Iraq. Trusting completely in God, the patriarch was to travel where God would lead him. As Abraham journeyed across the central Middle East from Mesopotamia to Egypt and back to what is now southern Israel, he and his son Isaac lay the foundations of a monotheistic tradition. Abraham's grandson Jacob sired the 12 sons who would bestow their names on the original 12 tribes. The second half of Genesis recounts their stories. But the appearance of Moses, beginning with the story of his being adopted by Pharaoh, marks another major turning point. Moses lived probably toward the end of the third quarter of the second millennium BCE, about 1300 BCE. His story occupies a larger portion of the Jewish scriptures than any other single figure. Stretching from the beginning of Exodus to the end of Deuteronomy. From his inaugural revelation at the burning bush to his leading the people called Israel. The special name divinely given to the patriarch Jacob. At last to the banks of the Jordan, Moses' story is that of the formation of a community of faith. At the center of that formative epoch is the pivotal revelation of the law at Sinai at about the midpoint of that journey. Sources do not record use of the word Jew. From the Hebrew Yehudi, until many centuries after Moses' time. Then the word referred to a member of the tribe of Judah, which in turn had given its name to the region called Judea.
How did Buddhism develop in the Himalayas?
Like Vietnam, the Himalayan kingdoms, Tibet, Sikkim, Nepal, Bhutan, also became part of the northern transmission. But there the various lineages that constitute Vajrayana, Thunderbolt vehicle, Buddhism took hold. Tibet was the homeland of this branch of the faith. With its distinctive blend of indigenous shamanism and esoteric interpretations of the Buddha's teaching. Tibetan Buddhists also developed their own extensive scriptural canon. Of all the subdivisions of the monastic Sangha that evolved across Asia, none is more varied and colorful than that of the Vajrayana. From its most famous lineage, the Gelugpa, comes the succession of holy men called Dalai Lamas.
Do Daoists and practitioners of CCT believe in miracles?
Devout Chinese, whether associated with Daoism or with some form of CCT, consider asking for special favors an ordinary part of being religious. In general, however, what many readers mean by the term miraculous would not quite describe. Even apparently spectacular results of supplicatory prayer and ritual in this context. A fundamental consequence of the yin/yang view of life is the conviction that there is an identifiable cause of everything, whether positive or negative. All evil, illness, and suffering is a result of disharmony and imbalance. It is true that ordinary people cannot always put their finger on the direct cause. But ritual specialists know about these things. More importantly, the gods and those spiritual beings who have found the secret of immortality can assist suffering humankind by bringing about needed balance and harmony of forces. A miracle in this context, therefore, might be a divine intervention not for the purpose of doing the impossible, but for helping the possible to happen more quickly and easily.
What does Shinto home worship entail?
Religiously committed Japanese families still maintain regular daily home rituals centered around the Kamidana, and perhaps also around the Butsudan or miniature Buddhist temple. Home shrines are dedicated and put into service when family members invite a priest over to install a talisman from the local shrine on which is written the name of the kami to be honored in the home. Worshippers perform a brief purification ritual and then do before the miniature shrine much the same thing they would do at an actual shrine. These rituals, often observed morning and evening, are generally very brief, lasting perhaps 3 to 5 minutes. Some families still ritually incorporate in the evening meal food offered to the kami.
Have women exercised leadership among Shinto practitioners?
In ancient times, women played an indispensable role as shamans in countless Shinto shrines. Even after imperial decrees reduced women's roles in shrine life, giving precedence to a male priesthood, women continued to fill some key positions. Well into the 16th century, for example, women functioned as priestesses in some shrines. The last of the priestesses was a young woman serving the Suwa shrine in Nagasaki. Women have long acted as spirit mediums consulted by many a priest over the centuries, as well as by individual worshippers. Restrictive legislation arising from the Meiji Restoration in 1868 dramatically curtailed women's official participation in shrine staff ministries. Only at the Ise Grand Shrine, sacred to the sun goddess Amaterasu, Does a woman currently hold the position of high priestess? During the Second World War, many women took over priestly functions when their husbands departed for military service.
Are Mormons Christians?
Members of The Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints consider the Bible a critical sacred text. And, as their official name suggests, consider themselves Christians. Anyone who visited the New Mormon Temple in St. Louis prior to its dedication in 1997 would have been impressed by the prominence of a huge statue of Jesus in the entrance tent. But one of Mormonism's central tenets presents a major problem for mainstream Christian tradition. That tenet is the belief in a prophet after Jesus, with its implication that the revelation of Jesus was not final and definitive. Mormon tradition regards the work of founder and prophet Joseph Smith, Jr. 1805–44, as a necessary corrective to centuries of corruption of the true Christian teaching of Jesus. Smith himself believed the scripture revealed to him, the Book of Mormon. Origin of the popular name of the church, did not replace the Bible but merely supplemented it. Today the majority of Mormons live in Utah, while most members of a branch called the Reorganized Church are headquartered in western Missouri.
What kind of religious calendar do Christians observe?
Most of the world's Christians mark time on the solar Gregorian calendar, a late medieval correction of the much older Julian calendar. Julius Caesar had initiated the calendar named after him in 46 BCE. But it was based on some miscalculations. In 1582, Pope Gregory XIII shortened the Julian year by 10 days and added a day to February every fourth or leap year. Some Eastern Christian churches still use the Julian calendar, so that their major feasts fall just less than 2 weeks later than those of the Western churches. Until the Gregorian Reform, Christians considered March 25 the beginning of the year, since that was judged to be the day on which Gabriel announced to Mary that she would give birth to Jesus. March 25, which had in ancient times been mistakenly calculated as the spring equinox, the first day of spring, remains the feast of the Annunciation. For centuries Christians continued to observe the timing of traditional Jewish feasts, which were movable within limits of specific agricultural seasons, such as planting and harvest times. Using the Jewish 7-day week, Christians gradually added fixed feasts, such as those of saints and martyrs. The custom of designating Sunday as a day of special religious observance began during the first generation after Jesus' death, and Emperor Constantine decreed it a day of rest in 321. Wednesdays and Fridays had anciently been days of fasting. a practice now surviving largely on the first day of Lent, Good Friday, and other Fridays during Lent. For most Christians, the year consists of 3 liturgical seasons: Advent and Christmastide, Lent, and an Eastertide that ends with Pentecost Sunday, and ordinary time until the first Sunday of the following Advent. Some Christians in Egypt and Ethiopia still use the solar Coptic calendar, based on the ancient Egyptian reckoning. Recent recalculations suggest that Jesus was actually born closer to 4 BCE than to the year 1.
How does Jewish tradition interpret history?
Large portions of the Hebrew Scriptures are some of the finest ancient historical writing. Authors of historical texts in the Bible do not merely catalog events chronologically. They evaluate their data and pass judgment on the main characters from a particular perspective that views all happenings as part of a greater divine plan. They discern patterns in human behavior and in God's ways of dealing with people. So, for example, the author of the book of Judges observes how, when the people do evil in the sight of God, God allows them to suffer the consequences. Once they've had enough chaos, they cry out to God for help. God then raises up a judge to rule the people, and justice reigns for 40 or 80 years. But when the strong ruler dies, the people again go astray, and the cycle starts again. Judges 2:16-23. History begins when God creates time and space, moves through many generations of human beings struggling with and for each other, and will come to an apocalyptic conclusion at a time known only to God. Above all, history is the arena in which God deals actively with humankind as a whole, but directs both special attention and expectation to the children of Israel.
Has Daoism ever been associated with millennialism or messianic movements?
Several major movements of a millenarian and messianic cast have been associated with Daoism. One occurred during the late 2nd century CE under the leadership of the 3 Zhang brothers, who claimed authority in the domains of heaven, earth, and humanity. They espoused a type of Daoism called Huang Lao, possibly a combination of the first parts of the names of Huang Di, the Yellow Emperor, and Lao Zi, and claimed divine origins for their eschatologically charged sacred text, the highest peace scripture. The brothers Zhang established a theocracy, complete with elaborate hierarchies. Toward the end of the 2nd century, the movement swelled into full-scale rebellion led by a military force called the Yellow Turbans. The rebellion fizzled even though its leaders considered 184 CE an ideal time, beginning as it did a fresh 60-year cycle. Shortly after that ill-fated rebellion in the east, another Zhang from an unrelated family organized a theocratic state that lasted from 186 to 216 CE. This Zhang Lu claimed the authority of his grandfather Zhang Daoling, 34 to 156 CE. Traditionally cited as the founder of the first deist religious movement, the Celestial Masters School. Both theocracies hoped to re-establish the utopian regimes they believed had existed in the past. After the 4th century, new and more powerful movements emerged, with various leaders claiming to be incarnations of a divinized Lao Zi, called Li Hung. All taught the expectation of a messiah and a final battle which only the elect would survive, to live on in their religious utopia. None had long-term repercussions. Loosely related by symbolism to the Yellow Turban Rebellion of 184 was the typing, highest peace. Rebellion of 1850-64. It was a syncretistic movement that borrowed heavily from Christian millennialist imagery.
What are some of the other days Shinto practitioners celebrate?
Obon Matsuri is one of those feasts whose timing is determined by adding a solar month to the lunar reckoning. Hence a feast formerly celebrated during the middle, i.e., full moon, of the 7th month now occurs during the middle of August, the 8th. On November 23 and 24 falls the New Food Festival, Nii name Sai. Acting as high priest, the emperor himself leads the ceremonies. When a newly enthroned emperor presides, the feast is called Great Food Festival. Daija Sai, and the ritual seals and formalizes the new ruler's accession. This is one of some 30 regular imperial ceremonies, Koshitsu Saishi, that occur through the year, most conducted privately within the palace. The autumnal equinox still calls for quite elaborate observances in some places. Suwa Shrine in Nagasaki, for example, holds its annual Okankai for 3 full rousing days and nights, involving a full range of activities, from raucous processions to solemn pre-dawn purifications conducted in almost total silence. The festival engages large numbers of worshippers actively. Festivities begin and end with more private rituals designed to bring the kami into the ceremony and see them back to their places of repose. Some ceremonies occur often but on a more ad hoc basis than the regularly scheduled festivals. Nearly every new architectural venture occasions special religiously inspired observances. Earth sanctification, Jichinsai, is a ritual of deist origin conducted by a Shinto priest to prepare the ground for new construction. Participants call on the kami of the place for protection. These ceremonies are roughly analogous to the American practice of hoisting a small evergreen to the top of a newly completed structure, perhaps religious in origin, but now purely customary. A rite called sentasei or sengu can occur on any number of occasions. In the ritual, a kami is relocated, either permanently to a new shrine or temporarily, such as during repairs, or for a matsuri, or for a time of repose in one of several of the deity's regular abodes. In the case of Ise shrine, for example, the ceremony happens every 20 years. When a new shrine is constructed on the grounds.
What are the main Jewish notions of afterlife?
Surprisingly little detailed information on the afterlife is given in the Hebrew scriptures. And mostly in the very latest material at that. We find a few vague references to a nondescript region called Sheol, a gray, dreary warehouse of souls. Not a place of absolute suffering, Sheol is little more than a synonym for death itself. Toward the latter centuries of the first millennium BCE, more concrete notions of afterlife begin to emerge. Propelling the development were questions of justice such as those that the Book of Job raised. If a just man like Job suffers so much in this life, and so many wicked people seem to flourish, perhaps retribution for one's deeds will be deferred until after death.
How did the early Christians regard the Jewish scriptures?
From the very beginning, the emergence of Christianity as a distinct tradition depended on the young community's exegesis of the Hebrew scriptures. Since the majority of the earliest Christians were Jewish by birth and education, they naturally regarded the Hebrew Bible as their own and as authoritative divine revelation.
What are some of the main of Confucian and CIT officials or ritual specialists?
Strictly speaking, Confucians have no separate structure of ritual officials. Bureaucrats of the imperial administration were responsible for offerings performed in Confucian memorial halls. The emperor himself was the supreme ritual specialist in the sense that he exercised sole rights to perform certain ceremonies judged essential to the good order of life under heaven. All subordinate, regional, and local ceremonies were delegated to the various ranks of the literati. Today, even in the absence of imperial structures, government officials still play that role. In imperial times, the emperor's administration was divided into 9 departments. Most important in this context was the Imperial Academy, whose chief officer was the Minister of Ceremonies. His function was similar to that of chief priest, since he was responsible for rituals performed in all imperial temples. A common ritual at local imperial altars required that a newly appointed local magistrate stay overnight before his official installation. In the temple of the spirit magistrate, a deity who was the earthly magistrate's celestial model.
What does the symbol called the swastika have to do with Hinduism?
The name swastika comes from a Sanskrit term that means all is well. It is a symbol of auspiciousness and good fortune. The symbol may derive from a four-spoked wheel. possibly connected with the crossed firebrands of ancient Vedic sacrifice. Originally a solar symbol, the swastika was anciently associated with Vishnu, but eventually became important in Buddhism as well. Even though Shiva has been particularly connected with lunar symbolism, the swastika has become common in the iconographic repertoire of Shaivites too. Swastikas can appear to be spinning either to the right or to the left, and have accordingly been associated with either the so-called right or left-handed sects of Shaktism and Tantrism. The female symbolism of the left-handed swastika was generally considered inauspicious. Nazi Germany adopted the right-handed swastika because they associated it with Aryan ethnicity and thus with their pretensions to ancient racial purity. Hindus and Buddhists continue to use the symbol in many contexts.
Are there characteristically Muslim views about how religion and political power come together?
Muslims often describe their tradition as a total way of life, a comprehensive approach that goes far beyond mere ritual observance or showing up at the mosque once a week. Some believe that such an all-encompassing teaching must ultimately be expressed in political terms. Referring to early Muslim community life under the Prophet's leadership in Medina as the ideal. Throughout history, Muslims have experimented with various models for balancing or integrating religious and civil authority. Some have worked well enough, allowing for freedom of religious practice and expression among members of religious minorities under Muslim rule. In fact, the historical record suggests that Muslims have been at least as successful as any other group at administering religiously sponsored regimes fairly and even-handedly. Muslims in various parts of the world today continue to believe that an Islamic government represents the best hope of justice in a troubled world. But in a world where religious pluralism is increasingly evident, dividing humankind along religious lines seems a less than desirable option. The challenge now, as in the past, is to live by the Quranic dictum, "There is no compulsion in religion."